Dylan Hart thought it was just another Craigslist gig, drop off a $900 trading card to some reclusive collector, get paid, go home. But when he pulled into a 7-Eleven parking lot at dusk, something felt off. The buyer was late. A shirtless man near the dumpster was practicing kung fu. And the longer Dylan waited, the heavier the air got. Then the buyer finally showed up, and within minutes, everything spiraled into chaos. A machete came out of nowhere. Tires screeched. Blood hit the pavement. What started as a harmless delivery turned into a near-death encounter that would haunt Dylan forever. Dylan Hart wasn't the kind of guy who expected life to go sideways. In his late 20s, with a degree in marketing and a resume full of short-term jobs, he had always figured he'd bounce back eventually. But after getting laid off from his third agency in a year and burning through his savings faster than expected, reality hit hard. Rent was due. Utilities piled up. And in the absence of job offers, Craigslist became his last lifeline. He wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't desperate enough to take anything sketchy, just gigs that kept him clothed, sane, and out of jail. That's when he stumbled into courier work, simple drop-offs paid in cash, no questions asked. At first, it felt like a temporary fix, $20 here, $40 there, but within a few weeks, Dylan had a steady client, a guy who bought and sold rare Japanese trading cards. It was weird, sure, but easy enough. And honestly, it felt kind of cool, like being a low-level smuggler but legal. Still, nothing about it warned Dylan that one delivery, one weird late-day meetup, would almost get him killed. Craigslist may have solved his rent problem, but it nearly cost him something far more valuable, his life. It didn't take long for Dylan to realize that this wasn't your typical courier job. His main client, a quiet 30-something named Miles Kent, operated out of a 2-bedroom apartment crammed with shelves of imported video games, vintage consoles, and rare trading cards sealed in plastic like museum artifacts. Miles barely made eye contact, spoke in short bursts, and always paid in cash, sometimes with generous tips, if Dylan delivered something particularly rare or pricey. One time, it was a Japanese Pokemon card worth $600. Another time, an unopened Game Boy prototype that looked like it belonged in the Smithsonian. Dylan never asked questions. He just showed up, grabbed the package, and hit the road. In return, he got consistency, something rare in Craigslist work. Miles called twice a week every week, without fail. Their arrangement became so routine that Dylan stopped thinking of it as odd. Sure, the items were expensive. Sure, the buyers were reclusive types who preferred meeting in neutral places like parking lots or rest stops. But nothing ever went wrong. Not until the day Miles handed him a plastic-wrapped card worth nearly $1,000 and said, "Be careful with this one." That was the first time Dylan noticed real tension in Miles's voice, and it wouldn't be the last. Dylan had made deliveries for Miles dozens of times, but something about this one felt different from the jump. Maybe it was the way Miles lingered at the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot, or how he kept glancing at the package like it might explode. When Dylan asked what made this card so special, Miles just shrugged. "It's a rare misprint," he muttered, "worth close to $1,000, maybe more to the right guy." That didn't faze Dylan. He'd transported valuable stuff before. But what did give him pause was what Miles said next. "Just be careful." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "You think the buyer's gonna rob me or something?" Miles hesitated. "No, not exactly. I just don't know him, that's all. First-time buyer. Wants to meet at a 7-Eleven off Route 19. Won't give his actual address. Says it's for security." Dylan tried to laugh it off, but then Miles added one last thing. "You carrying anything you know for protection?" Dylan blinked. "Dude, I'm delivering a trading card, not robbing a bank." Miles didn't press the issue, but the look on his face stuck with Dylan long after he left. This job had a weird energy, and his gut was starting to agree. The 7-Eleven on Route 19 wasn't in a bad part of town, but it had that eerie in-between vibe, too empty to feel safe, too public to feel private. Dylan pulled into the lot around 4:25 p.m., 5 minutes early. The sky was beginning to tint orange, casting long shadows across the rows of faded parking lines. He parked under a flickering street lamp and waited, keeping the engine running and the radio low. The buyer was supposed to meet him at 4:30 sharp. By 4:45, Dylan had drummed every surface of his steering wheel. By 5:00, the sun had dipped low and the unease had settled in. Then he saw him. A shirtless man, barefoot, hovering near a dented dumpster on the far end of the lot. His hair was wild, his can streaked with dirt, and he was of all things practicing kung fu. Slow, deliberate moves, high kicks, fists slicing the air. Dylan stared, unsure whether to laugh or lock his doors. The guy didn't seem aggressive, just off, maybe mentally ill, maybe high. Either way, Dylan didn't like it. He checked his rearview mirror. Still no buyer. Still the guy by the dumpster shadowboxing the air. Just as he was about to call it quits, a figure in a dark hoodie and baseball cap approached from the sidewalk, heading straight for his car. Dylan's stomach tightened. This had better be the buyer, because if it wasn't, something was about to go very, very wrong. To Dylan's relief, the guy in the hoodie turned out to be the buyer. He slid into the passenger seat like it wasn't weird at all, handed over a thick wad of 20s, and started inspecting the card with something close to reverence. "This is it?" he whispered, eyes wide through the plastic sleeve. "I've been chasing this one for years." Dylan nodded, watching him like a hawk. The cash checked out. The guy seemed normal, nerdy, sure, but harmless. As the buyer got out of the car, he paused, glancing toward the shirtless man by the dumpster. "Hey," he chuckled. "Is that guy with you?" Dylan gave a dry laugh. "Nah, he's just been out here doing karate since I got here." Weird as hell, right? The buyer smirked, mimicked a few kung fu moves, then strolled off toward the convenience store, still laughing to himself. For a moment, Dylan almost relaxed. Almost. But something about the way the shirtless man was staring, now locked onto the buyer, froze the breath in his lungs. The kung fu stopped. The rummaging began. Something sharp glinted in the man's hands, and Dylan's instincts screamed, "This isn't over yet." At first, Dylan wasn't even sure what he was seeing. The shirtless man, who had been oddly calm and theatrical just minutes earlier, was now hunched over the dumpster, digging through garbage bags like he was on a mission. Then came the glint, something long, metallic, shiny, a machete. Dylan blinked hard, thinking maybe his eyes were playing tricks in the fading daylight. But no. There it was. The man straightened up, blade in hand, and turned toward the buyer, who was still walking away, totally unaware. Dylan's gut turned cold. This is happening, he thought. Right now. The homeless man let out a low growl, something between a grunt and a war cry, and broke into a full sprint. Dylan's body reacted before his brain caught up. He slammed the horn 3 rapid-fire honks and threw the gear into drive. The buyer turned just in time to see death charging at him. He stumbled backward and hit the pavement, face first, legs tangled, yelling something incoherent. Dylan didn't hesitate. He floored it. The headlights cut through the dusk like a spotlight, and for a split second, the shirtless man froze, wide-eyed, deer-in-the-road style. And then, thud, he was gone from view. Tires screeched. People screamed. Doors flew open at the 7-Eleven as stunned customers rushed outside. Dylan slammed the brakes and jumped out. The shirtless man was sprawled on the concrete, a deep gash running along the side of his head, the machete lying just a few feet away. Blood pooled fast. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Others pointed at Dylan like he was the maniac. But before things spiraled further, the buyer, dazed, bleeding from his lips, stood up and yelled, "He saved my life!" And just like that, the chaos froze, if only for a moment. Within minutes, the parking lot became a war zone of red and blue lights, gawking bystanders, and shouted questions. The cops arrived fast, 2 patrol units and an unmarked SUV. Paramedics hovered over the attacker, now barely conscious, his head bandaged and leaking through the gauze. Dylan stood beside his car, hands visible, heart pounding like a jackhammer. Despite saving a man's life, he found himself treated like a potential suspect. One officer barked for his license and registration. Another asked if he'd been drinking. The buyer tried to explain, but the officers wanted proof. That proof came from the 7-Eleven manager who'd already pulled up the store's exterior surveillance feed. In grainy black and white, they watched the shirtless man dig through the dumpster, pull the machete, and charge the buyer. They saw Dylan honk, accelerate, and strike. After reviewing the footage twice, one officer finally looked up and said, "All right, you're free to go for now." But as Dylan turned to leave, another officer leaned in and offered one final warning. "If that guy dies, you're gonna want a lawyer." Dylan didn't sleep that night. He kept replaying the screech, the thud, the blood. In a split second, he'd gone from delivery guy to near defendant. Craigslist might have saved his rent, but it nearly ended everything else. In the days that followed, Dylan waited for the phone call, the one that would pull him into courtrooms, interviews, and maybe worse. But it never came. The machete-wielding man survived after a few days in the hospital. No charges were pressed, no lawsuits filed. The police took a final statement and told Dylan he was in the clear. Still, something had shifted. He couldn't walk past a homeless encampment or see a figure lingering in a parking lot without his pulse quickening. The smell of asphalt at dusk made his stomach tighten. He even caught himself checking Craigslist less and less. That near-death moment hadn't just rattled him, it had changed how he saw everything. One split-second choice made on instinct had put him inches from ruin. It was over, but in a strange way, it wasn't. Because every now and then, Dylan would glance in the mirror and see someone who had survived and couldn't forget it. Dylan doesn't see himself as a hero. He sees a guy who made a gut decision in a parking lot and barely walked away from it. The truth is, he still believes most people are good, but now he knows some aren't, and you can't always tell the difference until it's too late. That night didn't turn him into someone braver. It just made him someone more aware. Because survival isn't about being fearless. It's about knowing when fear is telling the truth. In his early 20s, Tyler Morse was just trying to scrape by. A high school dropout with no diploma and no backup plan, he turned to Craigslist to advertise his handyman services. At first, it worked surprisingly well. Easy jobs like hanging curtain rods, patching drywall, and installing shelves. It paid better than he expected, and for a while he didn't think twice about the risks. But gradually the jobs started leading him to stranger and more unsettling places. Rundown homes, odd clients, bad energy he couldn't shake. When friends asked why he quit, he'd always bring up one name, Evan Blake. One job, one house. That was all it took to make Tyler realize that not every door you walk through is just a doorway. It could be an entrance into something you don't want to be a part of. That day didn't just change his work. It changed how he looked at people forever. It started with a text message. Tyler had just wrapped up a drywall patch job when a Craigslist inquiry popped up on his phone. The guy's name was Evan Blake, and he said he needed help putting up a few shelves in a back room of his house on the far east side of Cleveland. "Simple job," Evan wrote. "I've got the shelves already. Just need someone with the tools." Tyler was used to vague Craigslist requests, but this one felt routine. No red flags, no weird demands. The only catch was the location, a faded neighborhood he didn't usually work in. Still, money was money, and Tyler figured it'd be a quick in-and-out job. He confirmed the address, loaded up his toolbox, and hit the road. It was the kind of cloudy afternoon that made everything feel a little heavier, a little slower. But Tyler wasn't superstitious. He just had one rule: finish fast and keep moving. He had no way of knowing that by the time he'd leave that house, everything about his rulebook and his gut instinct would be rewritten. As Tyler turned off the main road and onto a cracked side street lined with tired, sagging homes, something shifted in the pit of his stomach. The kind of shift that starts as a whisper but turns into a siren once you're in too deep. The house at the end of the block matched the address, 11327 Wainwright Avenue. It sat hunched behind a crooked chain-link fence, half swallowed by overgrown weeds. The front lawn was a scattered mess of garbage bags, rusted tools, and a broken lawn chair. A beat-up Ford sedan sat on cinder blocks in the driveway, its hood hanging open like a gaping jaw. One of the windows had duct tape crisscrossed where glass should have been. Tyler parked on the street and stared for a moment, hands still on the wheel. He'd seen rundown places before, this wasn't new. But this one felt heavier, like the air around it was soaked in something he couldn't name. Still, he grabbed his toolbox and walked up to the door. Before he could knock, it creaked open. Evan stood there, mid-20s lanky, with shaggy brown hair and eyes that never quite focused. "Hey, man," Evan mumbled, stepping aside. "Come on in, just gotta be kinda quiet." "Okay." "My Aunt Caroline's sleeping." Tyler gave a nod, forcing a polite smile. He wasn't thrilled, but he'd come this far. He stepped inside, not knowing that this simple Craigslist gig was about to turn into something far more chilling than he'd ever signed up for. The moment Tyler stepped inside, the air turned thick. Not hot, not humid, just still. It was the kind of air that made your skin itch and your instincts twitch. The hallway was dim, the curtains drawn, even though it was mid-afternoon. The place had that sour smell, something between mold-old food and something else Tyler couldn't quite place but didn't want to think about. Evan led him down a short hallway, mumbling about the wall where he wanted the shelves. As they moved, Tyler's boots stuck slightly to the linoleum floor, and his eyes caught glimpses of disarray. Stacks of yellowed newspapers, plates crusted with food. A box fan pointed at nothing. Finally, they reached the back room, and that's when Tyler's gut started screaming. Against one wall, sure enough, sat the shelves still in their box. But next to them was a worn-out recliner covered in thick blankets. Not neatly folded, more like draped piled. A lump rested underneath. A large lump. Tyler glanced at it and immediately felt his pulse change. The shape was unmistakably human. "That your aunt?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Evan gave a casual nod. "Yeah, she's just real tired." Tyler squinted. The bee, or what should have been the face, was covered by a washcloth. Not the whole head, just the face. And that detail alone made the hairs on his arms stand straight up. There was no rise and fall of breathing. No movement. Nothing. Tyler didn't know for sure what he was looking at, but deep down, he already knew. Still, he played it cool. "All right," he said, setting his toolbox down. "I'll take a look at the studs first." But every nerve in his body was suddenly wide awake, and what started as a routine gig was quickly turning into something he couldn't just walk away from. Tyler bent down to unzip his toolbox, but his eyes never left that lifeless mound on the recliner. Something was off, so off in fact, that every survival instinct he'd ever developed started lighting up like a switchboard. He was still trying to figure out what exactly was happening when Evan quietly stepped toward the door. Without a word, he dragged over what looked like a dusty car battery and slid it in front of the frame, blocking the only exit. "Door swings open too much," he muttered without making eye contact. "Keeps the cold air out." Tyler stood up slowly, hammer in hand, suddenly aware that he was now officially locked in a room with a man who might have just barricaded him inside and a woman who very well could be dead on the couch. He kept his voice light. "You sure this is the best time for shelves, man? I don't want to wake her up." Evan's grip tightened around something on the floor, a metal pipe. He lifted it with both hands and gave a half shrug. "Just moving this so nobody trips," he said. But the way he held it, knuckles white wrist tense, told Tyler something different. This wasn't about clumsiness. This was control. This was a warning. Tyler's heart pounded as he ran every possible scenario through his head. He didn't have a weapon, but the claw hammer might buy him a few seconds if things got ugly. Still, he didn't want it to get ugly. Not if he could help it. He decided to stall. "Let me check what kind of brackets I brought," he said, kneeling down again and pretending to dig through tools. He tossed out a few screws, glanced over his shoulder. Evan hadn't moved, but his eyes were fixed, watching. That room, heavy with silence, and the stale air of a body gone too long, felt like it could explode at any second. Tyler knew one thing he had to get out. But first, he had to make Evan believe he wasn't a threat. And that took every ounce of calm he had left. Tyler stayed crouched by his toolbox, fingers brushing the claw hammer he'd set aside, playing the part of the oblivious handyman, while his brain screamed at him to run. But charging the door wasn't an option, not with that car battery blocking the way, and Evan gripping that pipe like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. So Tyler shifted gears, leaned into his best performance, and forced a light chuckle. "Man, I gotta tell you, if someone started hammering next to me while I was sleeping, I'd come up swinging," he said, glancing toward the recliner. "Your aunt must be the deepest sleeper alive." Evan cracked a grin, the tension in his shoulders loosening just a little. "Yeah," he said softly. "She don't wake up easy. She's sick, real sick." Tyler raised his eyebrows, feigning concern. "Oh, she's sick? That explains it." Without warning, Evan walked to the recliner and peeled back the top blanket, just enough to reveal the outline of an arm and a pale hand. The washcloth still covered her face. Tyler forced himself to stay steady, to keep breathing, to not let his eyes dart. He could feel the heat rush behind his eyes, adrenaline mixing with dread. "Damn," he muttered. "She's out cold." Evan nodded. "Told you, man. It's fine. She won't mind." Tyler offered a slow nod and turned back to his tools. He was stalling, calculating, buying himself just enough time to come up with an excuse that didn't sound like he was trying to escape. Because if he spooked Evan now, that pipe might be the last thing he ever saw. And deep down, he had the awful feeling that this wasn't just about a dead body. It was about not being the next one. Tyler knew he was running out of time. He couldn't stall forever, and he didn't want to push Evan into panic or worse. So he went with the first lie that came to mind. "Ah, damn it," he said, slapping his hands against his jeans. "I brought the wrong brackets. These are for drywall, not plaster. I've got the right ones in the trunk." He stood up slowly, voice calm, movements measured. "Won't take a minute. I'll just grab 'em real quick." Evan squinted, suspicious for half a second. Tyler leaned in. "I'll leave my toolbox here, all right? You know I'm coming right back." That seemed to settle it. Evan nodded and stepped aside. With effort, he pushed the heavy battery just enough to clear the door. Tyler stepped out into the hallway, walked steadily toward the front, resisting every urge to sprint. Once outside, he hit the porch, then the sidewalk, then the driver's seat of his truck in seconds flat. He started the engine with a shaking hand and peeled off down the block without looking back. It wasn't until he'd pulled into a nearby strip mall that the weight of what had just happened crashed into him, and he reached for his phone to call 911. Tyler sat in his truck for a moment, engine idling, hands trembling against the steering wheel. His heartbeat thumped in his ears as he replayed every second of that encounter. Then, without hesitating, he dialed 911 and told the dispatcher exactly what had happened about the locked door, the pipe, the woman on the recliner, who hadn't moved an inch. The operator stayed calm, took notes, and promised someone would follow up. And sure enough, a few hours later, a detective called him back. Caroline Blake Evans' aunt had been dead for at least 2 days. But this wasn't a crime scene, at least not in the way Tyler expected. As it turned out, Evan wasn't some psychopath hiding a murder. He had severe cognitive impairments. His aunt had raised him alone after his parents vanished from the picture, and when she passed, he simply couldn't accept it. The pipe, the barricaded door, it wasn't malice. It was fear. Evan had no idea what to do and thought Tyler was there to take her away. The realization hit Tyler hard. What he'd taken as menace was, in truth, heartbreaking confusion. And it changed everything about how he looked at what happened inside that house. Tyler could have pressed charges, wrongful detainment, intimidation, maybe more. But he didn't. After hearing Evan's story, he declined to pursue anything. What good would it do? He later told a friend. The guy didn't need a court date, he needed help. It was the first and last time Tyler ever took a Craigslist job after that. He realized that walking into someone's home meant stepping into their world, their grief, their madness. Some people just needed shelves. Others needed something no tool could fix. That afternoon stuck with him, not because of how close he came to danger, but because of how close he came to someone else's sorrow. And that was the real weight he carried out of that house. And from that day on, Tyler never looked at his work the same way. It wasn't just about drills and drywall anymore, it was about instinct, awareness, and knowing when to walk away. He still keeps the old clawhammer in his truck, not just as a tool, but as a reminder. Some jobs pay in cash. Others leave you with stories you'll carry for the rest of your life. Almost no one moves to a place like Millstone, Texas, expecting to get rich or even comfortable overnight. And Caleb Moore certainly wasn't the exception. At just 25 years old, Caleb had taken a leap of faith, leaving behind a string of dead-end jobs and a noisy apartment in the city for a quieter, cheaper life in a small West Texas town he'd only ever seen on Google Maps. He had a job lined up at a local hardware distributor, something steady, not glamorous, but enough to cover the basics. Except 3 days before his start date, the company announced a hiring freeze due to budget adjustments. Caleb was left high and dry with barely $200 in savings and a rent payment due in 2 weeks. Still, he wasn't totally alone. He'd managed to find a decent roommate, Eli Weston, a wiry guy with a caffeine addiction and a knack for finding the weirdest corners of the internet. Eli had been living in Millstone for a few years, already working freelance tech gigs out of his room and collecting bizarre Craigslist posts like trading cards. When Caleb told him the job had fallen through, Eli barely blinked. "Don't worry," he said, tapping away on his mechanical keyboard. "Millstone always has something interesting going on." What Caleb didn't realize was just how interesting it would get. Sometimes in places like Millstone, what starts as a desperate search for quick cash ends up unlocking something far older and far stranger than anyone bargained for. By the next morning, Eli had already found something. Caleb was still rubbing sleep from his eyes when Eli knocked on the bedroom door, holding a steaming mug of gas station coffee and his old laptop under one arm. "You said you needed work, right?" He grinned. "Well, how do you feel about a little manual labor and maybe a haunted garage?" Caleb snorted. What Eli flipped the laptop around and pointed to a Craigslist post pulled from the gigs section under labor. It read, "Looking for someone to help clear out a garage full of junk. $100 per day. No experience necessary. Must be able to lift heavy objects and tolerate dust. Can-do attitude A+. The poster's name was Tom Reddick, a house flipper known around town for buying beat-up properties and turning them into something halfway livable. Caleb had never met him, but Eli nodded like it was a done deal. He's legit. Weird, but not serial killer weird. And he pays in cash. Desperation has a way of making decisions for you. By noon, Caleb had exchanged a few texts with Tom and locked in a start time for the next morning. It didn't sound glamorous, but the promise of $100 a day was more than enough motivation. Plus, there was something oddly intriguing about it all, the vagueness of the job, the old house, even the way the ad was worded. Caleb had a strange feeling he couldn't explain, like something was about to shift. He just didn't know that what he was walking into was less of a job and more of an awakening. Caleb arrived at the address a few minutes before 8 a.m., greeted by the soft orange glow of a Texas sunrise and the smell of mesquite drifting in from somewhere down the street. The house sat at the end of a cracked cul-de-sac, sagging slightly to one side like it had grown tired of holding itself up. The lawn was more weeds than grass, and the garage door looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. Still, when Tom Reddick stepped onto the porch holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee, he seemed friendly enough. Tall with a faded denim shirt and sun-weathered skin, Tom had the air of a man who'd seen too many summers but still had work left in him. After a few minutes of polite small talk, Tom led Caleb around to the garage and pulled open the side door. The smell hit him first. Dust, mildew, something metallic underneath it all. Then the light from the rising sun poured in, revealing the chaos inside. Piles of rusted tools, collapsed furniture boxes with no labels, and layers of grime. Old toys peeked out from under tarps, like ghostly relics of childhoods long gone. One corner was stacked nearly to the ceiling with cracked picture frames, broken lamps, and what looked like the remains of an old washing machine. "Yeah," Tom muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "This one's a doozy. Owner passed away, no family to claim it. Bank sold it to me as is. All this junk came with it." Caleb got to work tossing broken junk into the dumpster out front, while lining anything remotely salvageable in the driveway. A few hours in, he and Tom cleared a path to an old cabinet built into the back wall. Tom popped it open, brushed aside a layer of dust, and reached into the shadows. "Huh," he muttered, pulling out a wooden box the size of a loaf of bread. "What do we have here?" Caleb leaned in. The box was ornate, heavy, and locked tight with tarnished brass latches. Something about it felt out of place. Ancient. Almost watchful. Tom turned the box in his hands with a kind of reverence. The wood, once a rich mahogany, had faded to a dusty gray, but the engravings along its edge twisting vines. Tiny animal heads, a 6-pointed star in the center, remained sharp and distinct. "Feels like it's hiding something important," he said more to himself than to Caleb. With a quiet snap, the latch gave way. Inside was a revolver polished to a shine that defied the filth of the garage. Its barrel was long, its handle carved from what looked like bone, and the cylinder featured tiny etchings that mirrored the box's symbols. The gun looked like it belonged in a glass case, not in the back of an abandoned garage in Millstone. Tom whistled low. "This thing's got to be worth a few grand easy. Might even be silver-plated. Could be a museum piece." Caleb leaned in, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. Something about the revolver made his stomach clench, though he couldn't say why. It was just a gun, right? But it felt wrong. Like it had been waiting for someone. After a few more minutes of admiring the piece, Tom set it aside on a dusty workbench. "Let's break for lunch in a bit," he said. "I'll buy if you grab it. There's a barbecue joint on Millstone Drive, best brisket in the county." Caleb, starving and intrigued, agreed. Tom handed him a crisp $50 bill, and with the smell of dust still clinging to his clothes, Caleb drove off. He returned about 30 minutes later, arms full of brisket pickles and a tub of potato salad balanced in plastic bags. But as he came up the side of the house, something felt off. The sun was still high, the air still dry, but the silence around the house had changed. Heavy, like the world was holding its breath. He rounded the corner and found the garage door wide open. Tom stood with his back to him, motionless. "Hey man," Caleb called, trying to sound casual. "Got the food. Hope you're hungry." No response. He took a few steps forward, heart thudding now. Tom turned slowly, like waking from a trance. His eyes were bloodshot, no worse than bloodshot. One looked almost black, the veins thick and spidering, like ink under skin. A thin line of blood traced down from his left nostril, and in his right hand was the revolver. Caleb froze. Tom raised the gun slightly, but his arm shook like he was fighting it. His mouth opened, trying to speak, but nothing came out, only a wheeze. Caleb didn't wait for an explanation. He dropped the food and ran sprinting back down the driveway as 2 gunshots cracked behind him, followed by a crash that sounded like someone falling through a pile of metal. Reaching his car, he yanked open the glove box and grabbed his own pistol. He didn't know if Tom was coming after him or not, but one thing was clear. Something in that garage had changed the man, and whatever it was, it had happened the moment he touched that gun. Caleb stood outside the car, heart racing, hands trembling as he kept his eyes locked on the garage. The heavy silence returned, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the distant whir of cicadas. He didn't know if Tom was still in there, conscious, unconscious, or worse, but he wasn't about to find out the hard way. Instead of driving off and leaving it all behind, Caleb made a choice that surprised even himself. He flagged down a woman walking her dog at the end of the street, her face tightening in alarm as he blurted out what had happened. "Call 911, he said. "There's a man in that garage with a gun. Something's not right." Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed across the front of the house as a patrol car tore around the corner, tires screeching. Caleb stashed his own gun back in the glove box, hands raised when the officers approached. He quickly explained what he'd seen: Tom bleeding, holding the revolver, looking like he was possessed or disoriented beyond reason. The officers moved with caution, one circling to the rear, while the other advanced toward the open garage with his weapon drawn. Caleb waited, heart pounding. No shots rang out. Then came the shout. "We need EMS now!" Tom was alive, unconscious, but breathing. Paramedics arrived moments later, loading him onto a stretcher. A paramedic told Caleb they weren't sure what happened. Maybe a stroke, maybe a seizure, but the look on their faces said even they found it strange. As the ambulance sped off, Caleb was left staring at the open garage, the revolver now bagged and secured by police. And in the pit of his stomach, he felt it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Nearly a month passed before Caleb heard anything more. Life in Millstone returned to its slow rhythm, but he couldn't shake the memory. The look in Tom's eyes, the sudden violence, the sound of that gun splitting the air. He found himself replaying the moment over and over, wondering what might have happened if he'd walked in a few seconds later. Or if Tom hadn't stopped himself. Then, one quiet afternoon, Caleb's phone rang. The number wasn't saved, but he answered anyway. "Caleb, it's Tom Reddick." The voice was softer than he remembered, rougher. Tom apologized first for frightening him, for everything that had happened. Then he said he wanted to stop by in person. "I owe you more than just an apology," he added, "and I owe you some money." Caleb hesitated, but agreed. A few hours later, Tom pulled into the gravel driveway outside the rental house, moving slower, looking thinner. He sat down at the small kitchen table with Caleb cradling a cup of water in both hands like it weighed a pound. Tom explained that doctors had run every test they could think of: CT scans, blood panels, neurological assessments. Nothing conclusive. They suspected he had a seizure triggered by stress, or possibly a latent condition. But Tom knew when it started. "It was the second I picked up that gun again," he said. "Something about it. I don't know. It was like I wasn't me anymore." He paused, then pulled an envelope from his jacket. "The revolver sold," he said. "Didn't even make it to auction. A collector bought it on the spot, paid double the reserve price." Caleb opened the envelope and blinked. Inside was a thick wad of cash, at least $2,000. "I know I only owed you $100, Tom said. "But if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't run and got help, I might not be alive to sell that thing. Or worse, I might have done something I couldn't take back." Caleb wanted to argue, to say he just did what anyone else would have done. But deep down, he wasn't sure that was true. Something about that day had changed things for both of them, and the strange ancient revolver was only part of it. After that day, Caleb and Tom didn't cross paths again. Life moved forward slowly and quietly, as it tends to do in places like Millstone. But Caleb carried something with him, a question that never quite left. Not about the money or even the gun, but about how close he'd come to dying, and how close Tom had come to killing him. Sometimes on cool evenings, Caleb would sit on the porch and stare off toward the direction of that house. He'd wonder if the revolver had really caused it, or if it had just unlocked something already there, something buried deep inside, a man pushed too far. He thought about how Tom's eyes had changed, how it seemed like he'd been fighting himself for control. That image haunted Caleb more than the sound of the gunshots ever could. He never found out what happened to the revolver after the sale. Maybe it sat behind glass in some collector's vault. Maybe it was buried again in someone else's garage. All Caleb knew was that he'd walked into that job looking for cash, and walked out with a deeper understanding of how thin the line really is between normal life and something we can't explain. During her senior year at Asheville High, Kayla Morgan struck a deal with her dad. If she could find a job to pay for gas, he'd hand over the keys to his old Jeep Cherokee. That offer was all the push she needed. She wasn't looking for anything glamorous, just enough income to earn some independence. A friend had mentioned landing a few babysitting gigs on Craigslist, so Kayla gave it a shot. But instead of babysitting, she stumbled across something unexpected: dog sitting. At first, it seemed almost too good to be true. The ads didn't require previous experience, and most jobs involved a few hours of company for someone's pet. Kayla had grown up with dogs, retrievers, mutts, even a grumpy old beagle named Toby, so she felt confident, claiming she knew how to care for them. Her first job came from a listing about a boxer named Marley. She played fetch, made sure the water bowl stayed full, and walked away $30 richer after just a few hours. From that moment, she was hooked. It wasn't just the money. There was something peaceful about spending time with dogs in quiet houses, something that made her feel grown up and trusted. Unlike babysitting, where parents wanted resumes and references, dog owners mostly just wanted someone who wouldn't lose their keys or feed their golden retriever grapes. In a few short weeks, Kayla had enough clients to keep her weekends full and her gas tank from hitting empty. Dog sitting felt easy, comfortable, harmless. But maybe it was that same sense of comfort, the false security of quiet neighborhoods and polite smiles, that made her let her guard down. Because all it took was one strange job post in an upscale part of town to change everything she thought she knew about trust. After a few months of juggling dog-sitting gigs around Asheville, Kayla Morgan started becoming more selective. Some homes were cluttered, some dogs were too much to handle, and others gave her an uncomfortable vibe the moment she stepped inside. Over time, she'd learned to trust her gut. So when she spotted a Craigslist listing offering $90 for just 4 hours, it immediately raised an eyebrow. The job was located in Greenbrier Hills, a gated community known for its manicured lawns, winding streets, and houses that looked like they belonged in glossy real estate brochures. Kayla didn't hesitate. To her, the higher pay made perfect sense. Wealthier families were often more generous, and sometimes even overpaid, just to have peace of mind. The ad was brief, but straightforward. Seeking sitter for Great Dane named Maximus. 7 p.m., 11 p.m., must be responsible and comfortable with large dogs. No fluff, no red flags, at least not on the surface. When she called the number listed, she was greeted by a warm, polished voice that introduced herself as Mrs. Lennox. The woman sounded exactly how Kayla imagined someone from Greenbrier Hills might sound: sweet, refined. Maybe someone who arranged fresh flowers every Monday and owned a full set of monogrammed china. She explained that Maximus was just over 2 years old, weighed a little over 140 pounds, and was a bundle of energy. Because of his size and enthusiasm, they typically kept him in the kitchen while out for the evening to avoid broken furniture or bruised guests. Kayla laughed politely and agreed to come by Friday night. Everything about the call felt professional and friendly. She imagined a spacious kitchen, high-end dog bowls, and a goofy Great Dane with big paws and even bigger eyes. What she didn't imagine, what she couldn't have known, was how quickly the warmth of that call would fade, and how a job that seemed like the easiest $90 of her life would spiral into a night that made her rethink what safety really looked like. Friday evening rolled in with that crisp golden light that hits Asheville just right in early fall. Kayla Morgan drove up Mulberry Drive with the windows cracked, letting the breeze carry in the scent of leaves and distant wood smoke. When she reached the address, her eyes widened. The house was breathtaking, 3 stories tall with white brick walls, black shutters, and a curved cobblestone driveway that swept around a sprawling front lawn. A marble birdbath stood near the porch, like some kind of garden sculpture from a museum. Everything about it whispered wealth and control. She parked the Jeep off to the side and texted Mrs. Lennox to say she had arrived. Within seconds, the front door opened, and there stood the woman herself, just as Kayla had imagined. Perfect posture, silver blonde hair, pulled back in a low twist, wearing a pearl-buttoned cardigan and tailored slacks. She smiled with practiced warmth and invited Kayla inside. The house was pristine, not just clean curated. Soft classical music played from an unseen speaker. The hardwood floors gleamed, the walls were lined with oil paintings and carefully spaced wall sconces, and the whole place smelled faintly of cinnamon and rosewood. Mrs. Lennox led her to the living room and began going over the house rules. No visitors, no turning on the hot tub, no renting pay-per-view movies. All standard, if a bit formal. But something gnawed at Kayla's thoughts. She hadn't seen or heard any sign of a dog. No barking, no clicking toenails on the floor, no wet nose nudging at her hands like most dogs did the moment a stranger walked in. She waited until the conversation lulled before asking, "So where's Maximus?" Mrs. Lennox's expression didn't change, at least not at first. "Oh, he's downstairs in the basement," she replied smoothly. "He gets a little too excited when new people show up. We like to keep him calm until after we leave." Kayla nodded slowly, her instincts quietly waking up. Would it be okay if I just saw him through the door? So he gets used to my scent. That's when something shifted. Mrs. Lennox's polite smile dimmed slightly like a light bulb flickering. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice suddenly flatter, more clipped. The air in the room changed. Kayla felt it. The warmth was still there, but now it felt staged. She glanced toward the basement door in the hallway. Still no sound. Not a shuffle. Not a scratch. In all her time dog-sitting, she'd never once entered a home where the pet wasn't curious about her presence. And never once had she been refused even a quick introduction. Something wasn't right. And whatever was down those stairs, she was starting to believe it wasn't a Great Dane. Kayla didn't remember the exact moment the unease turned to dread. But as she stood a few feet from the basement door, something inside her froze. The Lennox home was so quiet, it almost rang. No panting, no scraping claws, no muffled thuds from a 140-pound Great Dane supposedly confined below. Just the slow tick of a decorative wall clock and the faint creaking of footsteps overhead, where Mr. Lennox was still allegedly getting ready. The silence was unnatural, stifling. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe the dog was asleep. Maybe they had given him a sedative. But none of it explained Mrs. Lennox's sudden coldness or the strange insistence that she not even see Maximus. Every other family Kayla had worked for wanted the dog sitter to meet the pet, let them sniff, say hello, establish a sense of trust. This wasn't that. This was off. So she asked bluntly, impulsively, almost against her better judgment, "Is there even a dog down there?" Mrs. Lennox stopped mid-step. Her manicured hand tightened around the back of a dining room chair. For a beat, her face froze. Then, in the same rehearsed tone she'd used on the phone, she smiled and replied with syrupy sweetness, "Of course there's a dog down there, sweetie. Here, listen." She strode to the basement door, balled her fist, and rapped 3 times sharp, deliberate knocks that echoed like a warning through the house. "Maximus." "You all right down there, boy?" she called in a bright, casual voice. Then it came. 3 short barks. Oof, oof, oof. Kayla's stomach turned. The sounds weren't right. They weren't deep or heavy like the bark of a Great Dane. They were too measured, too controlled, like someone doing a bad impression of a dog, like a person, pretending. She stared at Mrs. Lennox, and in that instant, Mrs. Lennox looked back, and her eyes betrayed her. The smile faltered. Her confidence wavered. She turned too fast, tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But Kayla had seen enough. She didn't speak. She didn't press further. Her instincts screamed, and she listened. Without a word, Kayla grabbed her bag and walked straight for the door. Behind her, Mrs. Lennox's voice rang out sweet and sugary again. At first, "Wait, honey, where are you going?" "He's harmless." Then sharper, angrier, desperate. She called Kayla ungrateful. Said she'd ruin her chances of getting work in Greenbrier Hills. And finally, as Kayla pulled open the front door and stepped into the night air, Mrs. Lennox shouted one last thing down the driveway. "I'll double the money. $180 cash." That was the moment Kayla knew. No one offers double just to sit near a dog. She didn't reply. She didn't look back. She marched across the stone path, slid into her Jeep, and turned the key with trembling hands. The house behind her disappeared in the rearview mirror as she drove through the soft pools of streetlight, the cold October air creeping into her sleeves. Later that night, she sat in her driveway, headlights off, heart still hammering. And the strangest thing was, the scariest part hadn't been the bark. It was the silence that came before it. When Kayla finally pulled into her driveway that night, her father was already waiting on the porch. He looked at the time, then at her face, pale, tight-lipped eyes, wide with something he didn't recognize at first. "You're early," he said. Kayla tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Her hands were still trembling from the drive. She looked at him, blinked hard, and finally whispered. Something wasn't right. It took less than 5 minutes for him to spring into action. The police were called. A report was filed. An officer stopped by their home that same night to take Kayla's statement. She told them everything right down to the fake bark and the look on Mrs. Lennox's face when she realized Kayla had figured it out. The next day, the cops followed up. They'd visited the house, searched the basement. According to them, it was empty. No dog crate, no food bowls, just dusty shelves, some old boxes, and a faint mildew smell. They couldn't press charges or even file an official complaint. But one officer made a point to tell Kayla that she had done the right thing. "If you don't feel safe," he said, "you don't owe anyone an explanation." Her dad couldn't stop repeating it either. You trusted your gut. That's what matters. And while Kayla nodded, part of her still felt cold, because deep down, she knew. Whatever was going on in that house, it didn't end when she walked away. She didn't need proof. She didn't need to know the whole story. Some truths were meant to be avoided, not uncovered. From that day on, Kayla never took another job off Craigslist. And though she still loved dogs, something inside her had changed. The world wasn't as tidy and trusting as she once believed. And now, every time she passed a white brick house on a hill, she couldn't help but wonder who or what might be waiting in the basement. Kayla never found out what was really going on in that house, and maybe she didn't need to. What mattered was that she listened to the voice inside her, the one that spoke not in words, but in warnings. Long after that night, she would still flinch at strange silences and look twice at job postings that sounded too good to be true. But she also carried with her something stronger than fear discernment. And maybe that was the most valuable thing she ever earned that year. Not a paycheck, not a Jeep, but the quiet power of trusting her instincts and walking away when the world smiled too much, too fast, and too wrong. If you enjoy true inspired stories that blur the line between the ordinary and the unsettling, don't forget to support the channel. Hit subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next strange, chilling, or unforgettable tale. Every like, every comment, and every share helps this community grow and gives us the fuel to keep digging into the stories that most people overlook. Thanks for being here. Stay curious. Stay safe.